Here's a complete cinematic story written as one continuous narrative, with emotional tension, suspense, redemption, and a satisfying ending. The helicopter was already lifting off when the pilot suddenly slammed both hands onto the controls and screamed for the engine to be shut down. Seconds later, the aircraft dropped back onto the landing pad, and every person standing around it went silent. 3 experienced pilots had refused to fly the machine that morning, and the reason was terrifying. The helicopter looked perfect from the outside, but something inside it was so dangerously wrong that one mistake in the air could turn it into a falling coffin. And the man who had warned them about it was the same single father they had humiliated, underpaid, and ordered off the property just hours earlier. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel so our community can keep bringing you stories that remind us never to judge a person's worth by their appearance. The man standing behind the safety barrier was 38-year-old Everett Shaw, a quiet single father with grease permanently embedded beneath his fingernails and a faded toolbox that had belonged to his late father. He was not wearing an expensive uniform or carrying a company badge. His work boots were scratched, his jacket had been repaired at the elbow, and there was a small photograph tucked inside the transparent lid of his toolbox showing his 9-year-old daughter, Maisie, smiling with 2 missing front teeth. Everett had spent most of his life learning how machines worked because machines had never cared whether he was rich or poor. They either worked or they didn't, and if they didn't, he stayed until he understood why. 3 weeks earlier, Everett had been hired by North Star Aviation to rebuild an executive helicopter that had been damaged during an emergency landing. The company was preparing the aircraft for a high-profile demonstration that could secure a major government contract, and the pressure from the executives was enormous. Everett wasn't officially hired as the lead engineer. He was brought in as a temporary reconstruction mechanic because the company needed someone willing to work long hours for a fraction of what a certified aviation engineering firm would charge. Everett accepted because he needed the money. His daughter had been struggling after the death of her mother, and Everett had promised her that no matter how difficult life became, he would make sure she never felt abandoned. From the first morning, Everett noticed things other workers ignored. The helicopter's frame had suffered more stress than the original inspection report claimed. Several components had been replaced, but the vibration pattern suggested something deeper. Everett spent hours examining the transmission assembly, hydraulic lines, rotor head, and control linkages. He discovered that one of the replacement components had been manufactured to specifications that looked correct on paper but did not behave correctly under prolonged vibration. He documented everything carefully and submitted a written warning to the company's engineering supervisor, Grant Mercer. Grant was a polished man in his early 50s who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder. He wore expensive watches, drove a silver sports car, and had a talent for making other people's work sound like his own. When Everett showed him the inspection notes, Grant barely looked at them. He told Everett that the helicopter had already passed its preliminary checks and that the company couldn't afford delays. Everett tried again, explaining that a component could pass a stationary inspection and still become dangerous once the aircraft reached operating speed. Grant became irritated and reminded him that he had been hired to rebuild the helicopter, not redesign it. Everett didn't argue. He simply returned to the aircraft and kept working. Over the next several days, he noticed another problem. The vibration wasn't random. It increased under a specific combination of rotor speed and hydraulic pressure. Everett realized that if the helicopter entered that condition during flight, the pilot could experience a sudden loss of control authority. It might last only seconds, but seconds were enough. He wrote another report. This time Grant became angry. The company had already invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into the project, and executives were expecting a demonstration. Grant accused Everett of exaggerating the danger because he wanted more money. Everett's face tightened, but he remained calm. He explained that he wasn't asking for additional pay. He was asking them not to put a pilot inside an aircraft he believed was unsafe. Grant told him the company had hired him to solve problems, not create them. Everett looked at the helicopter for a long moment and quietly said that sometimes the biggest problem was pretending there wasn't one. That sentence sealed his fate. The next morning, Everett was told his contract was terminated. Worse, Grant refused to pay him the final portion of his agreed wages, claiming that Everett had failed to complete the project on schedule. Everett stood outside the hangar with his toolbox in one hand and the photograph of Maisie tucked safely inside it. He knew he had done the work. He knew he had saved the company money by rebuilding parts other mechanics had declared unusable. He also knew that arguing with a powerful company would not put food on his daughter's table. So he walked away. That afternoon, Maisie noticed her father was unusually quiet. She asked if he had fixed the helicopter. Everett smiled and told her that sometimes fixing something meant having the courage to say it wasn't ready yet. Maisie didn't completely understand, but she hugged him anyway. That small hug gave Everett more strength than any paycheck ever had. The next morning, North Star Aviation prepared for the demonstration. Executives arrived in expensive vehicles. Investors gathered near the runway. Cameras were positioned around the landing area. Grant stood proudly beside the helicopter, telling everyone that the aircraft had been completely rebuilt and was ready to fly. But when the first pilot climbed inside, something went wrong. The pilot started the engine and began the initial systems check. Everything appeared normal. Then the rotor speed increased. A deep vibration traveled through the aircraft. The pilot stopped. He climbed out and quietly told Grant that he wasn't comfortable flying it. Grant was furious. He called another pilot. The second pilot performed the same checks. Again, the vibration appeared. Again, the pilot refused. By then, the investors were becoming nervous. Grant insisted they were being overly cautious and called a third pilot, an experienced test pilot named Callum Reeves, who had flown aircraft in some of the most demanding conditions imaginable. Callum climbed aboard with confidence. He ran through every procedure personally and began the startup sequence. For a few seconds, everything seemed perfect. Then the vibration returned. This time it was stronger. Callum immediately shut the aircraft down. He climbed out slowly, his expression pale. Grant demanded an explanation. Callum looked at the helicopter and said he wouldn't fly it. Grant asked why. Callum pointed toward the aircraft and explained that the machine was developing a dangerous oscillation under a specific operating condition. He couldn't guarantee that the control system would respond correctly if the vibration intensified in flight. Until the cause was identified, he would not put himself or anyone else inside it. Suddenly, everyone remembered Everett. One of the technicians found his inspection reports buried inside an email archive. The first warning was dated 12 days earlier. The second was dated 8 days later. Both clearly identified the vibration issue and the component Everett believed was responsible. The hangar became silent. Grant's face changed. He suddenly understood that the man he had accused of being difficult had been trying to protect everyone. But there was another problem. The investors were demanding answers, and the demonstration could not continue without a safe aircraft. Grant called Everett. Everett was at home that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while Maisie worked on a school project. When he saw Grant's name, he didn't answer immediately. He remembered the humiliation, the unpaid wages, and the way he had been treated as though his knowledge meant nothing. Then Maisie looked up and reminded him that he always said people deserved the chance to fix their mistakes. Everett answered the phone. Grant explained what had happened. Everett listened quietly. Then Grant asked if he would return. Everett looked at his daughter's school project and thought about how much they needed the money. But more importantly, he knew people were standing near a helicopter that could potentially hurt someone. He agreed. When Everett arrived at the hangar, nobody laughed at his old boots. Nobody questioned his toolbox. The same executives who had walked past him without noticing now watched every movement he made. Everett didn't celebrate. He simply went to work. He removed the suspect component and inspected it under magnification. He checked the mounting points, the surrounding assemblies, and the control linkage. After several hours, he discovered the problem wasn't only the replacement component. During the original emergency landing, a mounting structure had developed a microscopic deformation. It was almost invisible, but under certain vibration frequencies it shifted just enough to amplify the oscillation. Everett explained that replacing one part had only hidden the real problem. He repaired the damaged structure, replaced the affected component, recalibrated the system, and conducted repeated ground tests. The helicopter became quiet. The vibration disappeared. Callum ran another inspection. Then another. Finally, he agreed to fly it. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the daytime sky. Everyone watched as it climbed higher. Everett stood beside the runway with his hands resting on his toolbox. Maisie was standing beside him. When the helicopter completed its test flight and returned safely, the entire crowd erupted into applause. But Everett didn't smile immediately. Grant approached him. For the first time, the powerful executive looked embarrassed. He admitted that Everett had been right and that the company had treated him unfairly. He acknowledged that withholding Everett's wages had been wrong and that his own pride had nearly placed people in danger. Everett could have humiliated him. He could have demanded that everyone hear exactly how badly he had been treated. Instead, he simply said that being right didn't make what happened disappear, but admitting the mistake was the first step toward making it right. Grant paid Everett every dollar he owed. Then he offered him a permanent position. Everett hesitated. He didn't want a title. He didn't want revenge. He wanted respect, stability, and enough time to be a father. So he negotiated something the company had never considered before, a position where experienced mechanics could raise safety concerns without fear of losing their jobs. Grant agreed. Within months, Everett became the head of a new aircraft safety and reconstruction program. But the greatest change wasn't inside the company. It was inside Everett. For years, he had believed that being a single father meant constantly proving that he was strong enough to handle everything alone. He had carried grief quietly, worked until his body hurt, and rarely allowed himself to accept help. But after the helicopter incident, he realized that strength wasn't about carrying every burden by yourself. Sometimes strength meant protecting people even when nobody thanked you. Sometimes it meant forgiving someone without pretending they hadn't hurt you. And sometimes it meant allowing people to make amends. Grant changed too. He began spending more time with the mechanics and listening before making decisions. He personally apologized to several employees he had previously ignored. The company also created a formal safety review process where every technician, regardless of position, could report concerns directly to senior leadership. Months later, Everett was invited to speak at a small aviation training event. He brought Maisie with him. Standing before a room filled with young mechanics and engineers, he held up his father's old toolbox and explained that the most important tool wasn't a wrench, a scanner, or a computer. It was courage. Courage to speak when silence was easier. Courage to admit when you were wrong. Courage to walk away from something that wasn't right. And courage to return when returning could save someone. Maisie watched her father with shining eyes. After the event, she took his hand and told him she was proud of him. Everett squeezed her hand and smiled. He finally understood that the helicopter had never really been the story. The real story was about a man who had been told he wasn't worth paying, wasn't worth listening to, and wasn't important enough to matter. Yet when everyone else refused to fly, the world finally realized that the quietest person in the room had been the one trying hardest to keep everyone safe. And sometimes life works exactly like that. The people we overlook may be carrying the answers we desperately need. The person we dismiss may be the one who saves us. And the person we hurt may still be generous enough to give us a chance to become better. Before we reach the end, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Everett's greatest act of courage was: rebuilding the helicopter, standing up for safety, or choosing forgiveness when he had every reason to walk away forever. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the world doesn't recognize your value until the moment it desperately needs what only you can give. And when that moment comes, let your character speak louder than your circumstances, let your kindness be stronger than someone else's cruelty, and remember that being overlooked today never means you are without worth. Everett walked into that hangar as a man nobody wanted to pay, but he walked away knowing something far more valuable: he had never needed their approval to know who he was. He was a father who kept his promise, a mechanic who refused to compromise safety, and a human being who chose forgiveness without giving up his dignity. And that was worth more than any paycheck.